This week's online unit is going to be covering something that we call trace and archival data. Both of these types of data that are discussed in your book are what we call non-reactive measures, and I really just like to call this unit Psychology Without People, because this is the kind of data that you can get where you don't have to interview, observe, survey, talk to any sort of people. You can look at the stuff that they kind of leave behind and learn something about their psychology from that. So pretty cool. Technically speaking, a non-reactive measure means that it's a type of measure where the act of getting the data has no effect on behavior because the behavior has already occurred. So this is sort of our detective data. We're coming behind people to see what kind of relics, artifacts, traces, things that they've left behind to learn something important about those people. And the question is, how much can we know about human behavior without observing or interacting with any actual humans? So yes, we can do this. And a lot of psychologists or cultural anthropologists and archaeologists, this is a type of measure that they use a lot. It's actually pretty fun to get. So the first type of data that we're going to talk about is what we call physical trace evidence. Physical trace studies, what they do are examine the things that you can see, the physical evidence that are left by an individual's behavior. There's two main types of that, if you want to break it down. The first type is a trace byproduct, which means some sort of behavioral thing that was left just sort of on accident, like trash on campus. If you wanted to go around and see what student consumption is like by looking at what kind of trash, what kind of waste they leave behind, that would be called a trace. A trace is really different from a product. A product is something that's purposefully created by individuals that we can study, that they leave behind. So this would be looking at flyers or other physical things that people are putting up on purpose that we can learn from. So a trace, remember, that's just something that's a byproduct of behavior. That would be trash, fingerprints, things that people are not purposefully creating, versus their flyers and things that they put up. So you can think we could probably learn some really interesting things, even on this campus, about UT Tyler students by looking at the types of flyers that are posted. So what kind of activities are our students into? What are their political affiliations? Presence or absence of Greek life, by looking at the type of products that they leave on campus. You can also break physical traces down into two other ways, and that's whether it's a leaving behind of something or a wearing away of something. So an accretion trace measure is going to be one where we're looking at an accumulation of evidence. So this would be, where is most of the trash on campus located? That might tell us where some of the most frequent eating spots are, if we see a lot of food trash there. Erosion measures are really just the opposite. So that's looking at what are the patterns of wear in the environment. So an erosion measure might be if you go and see little paths in the grass around the sidewalk, that might be telling you, well, this is a really frequent path that students take that must be really convenient for them. So maybe we should add in a new sidewalk based on this erosion measure. So accretion means things are building up. So where is more and more of the trash located? Or an erosion measure is, where are most of the wear patterns on the carpet or in the grass? So where are things kind of wearing away? So let's think about what are the benefits of possibly using these kind of physical trace measures. And the biggest one that I can think of is that data is really, really easy to get. It's very easy to find available, simple to collect trace data. Because you don't have to go out and interview somebody, you don't have to get their consent, you can just kind of walk around and look and make really careful observations. The biggest drawback is that you don't have any control over people's behavior in these situations. And when you don't have any control over your study environment, you've got to be a little bit worried about factors that are going to affect the validity of your study, so how true your results are. The biggest one in these trace studies is what we call selective survival. So selective survival means that, let's say you're looking at trash traces to see what kinds of products students are using. If we're looking at trash on campus, there are some types of traces that are going to take a lot longer to erode than other types of traces. So paper is really easy to blow away, to erode, to get stomped into the ground, way more so than plastic. So if we were just looking at the different types of traces based on that, we might notice a lot more plastic and aluminum and glass just because it survives a lot longer than paper. So that would be affecting the kind of conclusions that we get, because we wouldn't be seeing any of that trace evidence left from the paper because it was already gone by the time we were looking at our data. So that's a problem with validity, because we're drawing kind of the wrong conclusions. Selective deposit is another really interesting example of a validity problem. So not all traces that are going to be left are equally representative. So my favorite example of this is there are psychologists who have done studies at a museum where they have two paintings and they put them both behind glass. And they want to see which painting people kind of like and interact with the best by looking at how many fingerprints are on the glass of each painting. Now, the problem with that is most adults that go into a museum are not usually going to try to go up and touch the paintings. If you've got a painting that has a whole bunch of fingerprints on it, that might just be the one that kids liked the most, because kids are much more likely to deposit their fingerprints on the glass than adults. So that might be affecting the validity of your conclusion. If you just looked at the one with the most fingerprints, that's maybe only going to tell you which one the kids liked the most. We'd probably have to use a different kind of measure, maybe like footprint analysis, to see which one actually got the most traffic. So that's a problem with deposit. Okay, so that was trace data. Another type of non-reactive data we're going to talk about really quickly is called archival data. And archival data is the collection of any sort of transcribed record. So we're talking written records, video, or audio recordings, and then kind of mining through that data to draw some conclusions about human behavior. This even includes things like websites, newspapers, census data, police reports, transcriptions of interviews, looking at wedding and funeral announcements in the newspaper. I mean, you can think of so many interesting questions that we could answer based on looking at that data. So let's just think about if we had newspaper archives of wedding announcements from the last 50 years, we could learn a lot about how culture has shifted just by looking at those archives, those traces of people's wedding announcements. So what was the average age of the bride and groom on marriage? How do they describe the parents of the bride and groom? Where do they say they're getting married? Is there any cultural shift in the way we think about weddings and gender that we can tell just by looking at these wedding announcements? That would be a really, really cool archival study. So again, things to think about when you're doing your archival data project. How do you decide what you're actually going to code from this huge possible source of archival information? This is called the data reduction problem. So let's say you're coding news blogs for how they describe scientific findings. Where do you even start with that? There are, I don't want to say infinite because that's probably not true, but let's say a whole lot of news blogs out there on the internet that talk about scientific findings. How are you going to decide which ones to code, how often, and what kinds of things are you going to be looking for in their descriptions? Because that's a whole lot of data, and it's probably kind of beyond the scope of one project. So just like when you had to decide how to operationalize your observation variables, you have to really narrow down and operationalize what you're going to be coding from those archives. You also have to think about, again, since we don't have any control over the production of these archives, what are the biases inherent in the sources from which you're gathering your information? So again, if we're looking at news websites, maybe trying to figure out, well, what are the biases of the reporters on these websites that could be affecting the kind of data that I get? So any biases inherent in the people making the archives are going to kind of trickle down and really kind of skew the data that you get. So you have to, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do those kinds of studies. You just have to be really cognizant of that when you're doing your analysis. And then the last thing that's really important that I think people forget about when we're doing studies where we're kind of coming behind people and looking at what they've left behind is, do we actually have to think about the ethics of using this data? So whose permission do we even need to analyze archival data or analyze trace data? So on the one hand, you might think, well, it's public record. These people put this out on the internet, or they put it out in a newspaper or in a public forum. That means it's free reign for me to analyze. And usually, honestly, that's the case. But you still have to think about how you're going to protect the privacy of people who, I mean, they're not people who consented to be in a study when they put their wedding announcement in a paper. They don't know that you're coming behind and doing this. So what you have to do, even when you're doing these types of studies where you're not actively interacting with participants, you still have to go through the IRB and get an approval for what you're doing, because the people who run the IRB are still really in tune to these sorts of ethical considerations for archival data. So let's say you were doing that study of people's wedding announcements in the paper. Even though it was out there for the public record, you still don't want to use their names in your study. So you still want to kind of look at differences at the group level and not say, well, Amy and Kevin's wedding looks like it was super gendered and antiquated. Good job, Amy and Kevin. You don't want to put that in your paper. You just want to make sure that even though you're using this public information, you're protecting the privacy of the people whose information got put out there in the first place, if that makes sense. And that's all you really need to know. I think that pretty much covers it for what you need to know from that chapter about non-reactive data.